All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Sherry Totoki, Senior Director of Startup Programs here at GreenBiz, and I want to welcome you all to our second webcast in our startup series today. Quick reminder to just be adding your startup sector and stage in the chat so that we know who is in the audience. So I would like to pass it over to Anna Maria, who will be our host for this webcast today, along with Saloni Moltani and Katie Fehrenbacher, who will also be our panelists joining us. So thank you so much for joining, and keep the introductions coming. We'll be kind of speaking to the sectors and the stages as you all let us know. So I'll pass it over to you, Anna Maria.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. And thanks to you and GreenBiz for hosting this second webcast. Hopefully some folks today were able to join us the first time, and regardless, welcome. I'm Anna Maria White, and we're going to do some quick introductions before we dive into our conversation. So I always like to start these conversations with a little bit of climate origin story, especially because in so many ways, climate is a little bit of a new sector. It's always fascinating to see how people got here. So I'll share mine, and then I'm going to invite my guests today to do the same. I've been working in strategic communications for over 20 years, and I've worked in lots of different industries, from consumer products to aerospace to politics, just all over the map. And what I always loved about that was the ability for communications to have an impact for the business, for the employees. That was really my favorite part. No matter what the industry was, there was always that ability for comms to help move the needle. So a few years ago, my family decided to move from LA to Seattle, in part because of climate change. LA is a desert, and there's a lot of pollution, and so we had to make a change. And of course, the pandemic seemed like a great time to blow up your life and do something completely different. So now we're in Seattle. Fast forward 2 years, we're in Seattle, and about 8 months ago, my daughter's favorite book was The Lorax. I don't know if anyone remembers that, if you've read that recently, but it's basically like Dr. Seuss's treatise on the evils of capitalism. And it got to the point where there was this one page that I just couldn't get through without choking up. And my daughter would literally say, "Mommy, please don't use your sad voice when you read the book today." And I was like, I just can't anymore. We can't be climate refugees, basically, without me trying to actually fix the problem as well. So a few months ago, I left my day job and I started my own company, White Star Communications. And now I have the privilege of using communications to have an impact by helping climate funds and early stage companies with their communications. And I'm privileged to be working with a company here in Seattle called iGen, and a number of others around the country. So that's how I got here today. And Saloni, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and your story as well.
Sure, some definite parallels to yours. So I've been an investor for the entirety, really, of my career. Currently have the privilege of being co-head and co-founded a fund called the Innovation and Expansion Fund at a new firm called Galvanized Climate Solutions, which, as the name suggests, is dedicated to funding companies that are deploying solutions that are driving either decarbonization or climate resilience. And my journey, I was a generalist investor for the first 15, 16 years of my career. And in 2016, I have two girls who are today 12 and 10. And in 2016, I looked at them, and my older one had started, to kind of put the pieces together as, they had, spare the air days that were inspired, not just by, pollution from cars, but actually from smoke from local fires. As they started to have those days at school, I realized that I, similar to you and Maria, just needed to align my time with trying to all the things I could do to secure a livable future for them. Felt like there was a few things that were more important. And so that's really been since the sole focus of my work. And what I love about investing and working with companies is, one, the learning and the education I get the opportunity to get every day as I talk to and meet companies, and then partnering with those companies to try to connect dots and to try to move faster. None of us know what the world holds for us, particularly when you're working with climate companies, but as we're all trying to work through it together, it feels really great to be a part of, one really big team that is ultimately, hopefully, all of humanity, but, trying to tackle this problem. So thanks for having me, and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today. And Katie, I'd love to hear a little, would you share a little bit about your background with our audience?
Sure. I'm glad to be back with the Green Biz community. Excited to chat with you guys today. My background is in journalism. I started as a tech reporter back in 2002. And then around 2007, I was working for a company called GigaOM. It was Om Malik's media startup. And I saw all these venture capitalists starting to invest in climate tech, clean tech, as they called it back then. So I started covering in 2007, kind of a interesting time to start covering. It was like a mini bubble and bust, and then like a slow backup growth to the crazy 2021s. And after GigaOM, I joined Fortune. I was with Green Biz for several years. And then right now I'm writing a newsletter for Axios focused on climate tech deals. That's a subscription-based newsletter. So we focus very closely on startups, fundraisings, M&A, IPOs, so deal activity in the climate tech space.
Everyone, if you're not, you should be an avid reader of Katie's.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yay.
100%. And so, Katie, what was it kind of just following where like you saw investors going? Is that kind of how you got into covering climate specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, maybe it's a little bit different than you guys who have called to action for the climate sector, but yeah, I think I was covering mobile, wireless, broadband startups. And I just thought the most interesting things were happening in climate tech. I saw the most interesting startups. I thought the most interesting people were investing. I liked that it was just kind of like a Wild West space. So like as a journalist, I wanted to like go where I thought like exciting things were happening. I also, believe strongly in climate, but that wasn't necessarily my motivation for doing that.
Yeah, well, that's great that you get to do both. And I love your description of the Wild Wild West. It still kind of does feel like that a little bit. And I think that's part of what we're actually going to touch on today. So maybe let's really quickly do an overview of our agenda and then we can dive in. So today, Sherry, do you mind helping us with that slide? Awesome, thank you. So here's the three main topics that we're going to cover today. And the reason we wanted to take a quick second to review this with everyone who's joining us is because it is a little bit of a build. You can't have a successful pitch unless you know how to get attention and you know what your story is. So we're going to start with a compelling story, and we have some really unique perspectives from Saloni and Katie when their different view of the climate space. So we'll talk about their different perspectives there and tips, and then talking about how to get attention, and then finally like tips for a successful pitch. And so with that, maybe let's dive in. Let's just get started with that first topic. So crafting a compelling story. And this is purposely a very broad topic, right? Because especially as climate being the wild, wild west and so much new happening, there's so many different ways that you could classify a compelling story. So Saloni, if you wouldn't mind maybe just talking us through a little bit what that means to you and kind of what you look for as you, I'm sure, get pitched all the time by folks trying to tell their story.
Yeah, and of course, every pitch is different, and every sector is different, and every market opportunity is different. It differs by stage of company. So I'll try to lay some things out, but there is definitely no one size fits all, which is completely unhelpful guidance. But I'd say, one thing that I found that is distinct from, in my investing career and working with climate companies and earlier stage companies is that oftentimes you're talking about creating a category. And so you are trying to help people, really help investors think about, this thing that people don't do today. Why will they start doing it? And why will they use you to do it? And being able to marry, again, in the categories and the companies we look at, what are the decarbonization benefits you offer? How does that line up with the ROI you can deliver to customers? Is ROI what's really catalyzing purchase? Is it ROI? Is it decarbonization? Is it a combination? Is it a compliance need? Really being able to clearly articulate a phrase that another investor, so I can't take credit for this, articulated to me once was, companies should be able to describe what they do uniquely well that their customers are desperate for. And that's particularly true in kind of enterprise style applications, where enterprises, tend to be reticent to work with young companies unless they're really desperate and they're not getting what they need from the existing market. But I think it's, you can sort of apply that lens to consumer facing tools and technologies as well, and certainly can apply it to incumbent industries that, have otherwise been slow to change. Why are they desperate? What are they desperate for? And what do you deliver to them uniquely that they're not getting from the existing market? And then the last thing I'll say, and sorry if I'm going too long, just cut me off, is understanding, look, ultimately in climate, everything a company does, ultimately, even if it's a pure software business, has to touch the physical world. As much as I wish we could just throw a bunch of ones and zeros in the air and solve this problem, it has to touch the physical world. So demonstrating an understanding of the physical system, the physical asset base, often the incumbent asset base in which you're working and trying to deploy into. How does it work today? What are the bottlenecks and the friction points to deployment? Are you dealing with sunk costs, capital with certain replacement cycles? How are you going to accelerate those replacement cycles? Being able to really articulate the status quo and how you are addressing the friction points to deployment is really critical, because those end up being oftentimes, these solutions all make so much sense. We have so much capacity in terms of the technical tools we have to do things better, faster, cheaper, greener. It's all of these incumbent economy friction points that are kind of slowing us, that are slowing deployment and slowing us down. And so, we really look for companies that can deploy at scale in the next decade. So that ends up being something, we really push on with our companies.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Katie, I'm wondering if from your wearing your journalist hat, what do you think about some of that guidance that Saloni offered, and what maybe would you add to that?
Great. I think it's very specific. Crafting a compelling pitch is very specific for the journalist that you want attention for, and same thing for an investor you want money for. So I'll just use the examples of Axios. My newsletter specifically is very deals focused. So there's very financial aspect. So you would know that, pitching as a product, like we're launching this product, is not necessarily a fit that we'd cover. Specifically, we really like exclusives. We try to get information that other publications aren't having, since we're growing very kind of niche and narrow. We want to kind of bring new information to our subscribers. So working with us on exclusive information is something we're always looking for. So, I think it's very tailored. It's the same thing with when you're pitching an investor. I don't think you'd want to galvanize a super early stage, direct air capture. I don't know, maybe you guys are in those deals, but a very early stage, super high tech science and tech risk is probably not a good fit for pitching Galvanize. So I think knowing your audience of who the story is going to is key.
That's a great point. Thank you. And I think maybe that goes back a little bit to what Saloni said earlier too, about understanding your audience, right? So Saloni, you said that you want to understand your customers and make sure that you can define as a startup, why your customers are desperate for what you're offering. It also sounds like there's the other side of that coin is understand why the person you're talking to would be really interested in what you have to say. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, look, it's interesting from an investor perspective, your ability to do what Katie described, align your message to your audience, is actually in and of itself a bit of a tell. And so it's kind of maybe it's a funny thing to say, but as an executive at a startup, your job is pretty much, certainly a CEO, you're selling all the time. You're trying to sell employees on the dream. You're trying to sell investors on the dream. You're trying to sell your actual customers as well on your product and your value proposition. And so, to Katie's point, if you're not aligning your message with your target audience when they're talking to you, are they doing it when they talk to their customers? Are they doing it when they're trying to recruit employees? And so it is, there's sort of the assessment there. I think also, it is whether true or not, it's sort of, that's our window into, how good are you at aligning your message to the relevant stakeholder sitting in front of you.
That's a great point. Yeah. And so as an investor, if you're sitting there and like the pitch that you're getting just isn't resonating with you, then it's probably not resonating with this company's customer. And there's a gap there. Maybe.
Yeah, it's just sort of like, are they good at understanding the needs of the person they're sitting across the table from? Are they good at assessing the needs of the market to design a product that actually meets the needs of the market, right? It's sort of, ultimately you're investing in people's judgments, because so much of it is on the come, right? With an early company, it's not like you're investing in necessarily a business that has a fully developed value proposition and a fully developed go-to-market. And by the way, in climate companies, if we had really fully developed markets for all of these different carbon applications, we wouldn't be in this pickle. So, we're all together in this like process of trying to figure out what will work, what will deploy. And so, it's just sort of an indication of whether or not you're aligned in terms of judgments, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, Katie, did you want to add something?
Oh, I was going to say, I thought it might be helpful. I wrote about one of Saloni's companies, Pulsora, a couple weeks ago. So like maybe we could use that as an example.
Yeah.
It was a company, it's a crowded-ish space, carbon software. But the founder has a really super interesting story. He did kind of all this extensive like research to build a product, and has his background of a successful tech entrepreneur. And their news was that they're raising funding. I think they worked with us to do an exclusive on that story. But also the timing was super newsy because I think it was like 2 weeks later, California's carbon disclosure bill was passed. So there's a lot of like trends happening that our readers would be interested in following. So that's something we wrote about. And actually I wrote a follow-on piece about, when the carbon bill was passed, kind of different carbon accounting software companies kind of getting funding from investors. So, maybe I know we want to talk a little bit about like looking at crowded spaces and kind of how to stand out. But I think that's particularly an example of one, that company that she backed.
And that, by the way, just picking up on that from an investor perspective, being able to link your product, this concept of creating markets, like markets can get created by a lot of things. There's a decarb imperative, which we've had for a while and we need to have for a while, but what else is going to make people desperate for what you do? And to Katie's point, like if you have something that aligns with regulation that you can clearly articulate how your product maps to that, because there's a lot of amorphousness around a lot of this. It's like, yeah, people will decarb and they'll want our product more. And you sort of say, oh, yes, okay, everything we look at has a decarb objective, but why you specifically, how are you specifically designing your product to meet what the market will look like specifically? The more lines you can draw between what you believe the market will look like and how you are designing your product to meet that need, I think the more powerful the case.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And Katie, you touched on something there that I think we had in our kind of topics for today, which was when and how to use trends in the story that you're telling. So it sounds like Saloni and her team had this great timing about like having this story come out before a really big piece of news was coming in this trend. So are there like and obviously that's probably a hard needle thread, but maybe you can talk a little bit about like certain trends or ways that folks can maybe use trends to make their story timely, but also still make sure that they're not one of a crowd, making sure that they can still differentiate themselves.
Yeah. I don't know. I know they invested because, this company was kind of, looking at this market, but, a little bit of luck involved probably with the.
If only I could predict the California legislature timing. Will definitely not profess to be that.
Saloni, we all need your 8 ball, right? Like we all need you.
Well, another example with that story, I did the trend story on like carbon accounting software investments. I think it was like that morning, another comms firm had pitched me on somebody. It was, like a VP of another carbon accounting software company. And I was really trying to like figure out help getting differentiation in this market, like how to look at these companies. And so like early in the morning in my inbox, they're like, this guy is, has been in the space a while. And so sometimes it's really helpful to just talk to different voices who are in the space and can like guide me on, oh, these companies are, really focused on ESG and these ones are, going deeper into whatever, blah, blah, blah. And so I actually included like a couple quotes from that interview, and it was like a totally random cold PR pitch into my inbox in the morning. That had really good timing. And I just really needed some extra voices to like navigate that market. And so he was very helpful. So that's like an example of like a purely like timing pitch that was trend and timing based that I accepted.
That's interesting. So, and then is that something that maybe like companies could bring to you, like bring different voices maybe outside of their immediate pitch just to help explain? And then this is going to lead into a topic for Saloni about defining categories and defining white space. But as a journalist, especially when you're dealing with a relatively new space or potentially like a trend in a space, if a company was able to come to you with like 2 or 3 outside voices that could also talk about this topic, is that something that would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I would say come with one pitch, but so I think that pitch was like the California bill just passed. It was like 6 a.m. in the morning. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm like working on the story. And it was, I don't think it was around funding or news or anything. I just really needed some guidance. So it was just purely good timing. Yeah, I would say pitch one person if it's a sector that like is crowded so they can help, or it's something like very, difficult to understand, very like highly technical, can provide like a little bit of illumination into, something with very deep like biology or chemistry or something that I just, my college science classes do not get me far enough on, where they can just kind of help me figure out, what is going on here. And we do a lot of interviews on background. And so, I try to get people to, be frank and speak what they feel, to like actually give me what the industry is like, or, the challenges in it, so that we can speak in reality. And then, I can work with them more, like if there's a specific quote I want to use. So I always try to make people who want to chat with me feel comfortable.
Awesome. Thank you. Saloni, anything to add there?
In terms of just kind of trends and navigating trends, I mean, I would sort of distinguish maybe between tailwinds, like thematic tailwinds, or market creation tailwinds, like regulation, a push to scope 3, a push to transparency generally around environmental and social impacts. So I think about that less of a trend, and although I didn't thread the needle and time it perfectly, we do believe thematically that we are moving in the direction of greater transparency, of the need for greater data rigor, like the need for more sort of ground truth information, and that theme sort of pervades a lot of our investing. Can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't measure the impact of an intervention, then what's the point of the data? So if you actually make an intervention but your numbers stay the same because you're using a dollar-based sort of protocol that doesn't feel like in the world we're moving to is going to be enough. So I'd say those I think about as being kind of themes and tailwinds long term. Then there are things that I think are more like functional trends or capability trends. Like we've now had breakthroughs in AI, or we've had breakthroughs in blockchain utilization. Those I think about as being sort of functional technical capabilities, and I want to see that a company is able to leverage them in building their product and solution and value proposition. Because if you don't, and that's what everyone is, if that's what everyone's embedding, then you're going to be behind, right? You're unlikely to win in a space where that capability is relevant if you're not good at it and all of your competitors are using it. but in and of itself is not sufficient, right? It's not enough to say you do AI. It's, how are you leveraging it in your business specifically? How are you, and honestly, a lot of people think about it as like, the ChatGPT version of like being able to query things that your customers can do. A lot of it is like, how are you using it in your internal businesses? How are you making yourself faster and more nimble in developing product and enabling sort of collaboration across your team? So it's, really hearing kind of an understanding of the power of the functional capability is sort of what we look for, rather than just kind of like latching onto a trend.
Right.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I think I was
go
gonna say
ahead,
from a
Katie.
journalist perspective, I mean, I think just making sure you know that, where the trend is at. Like, for example, with AI, like kind of across Axios, not to divulge our sausage making, but they, I like some editors will be like, no more kind of AI backed, TK startup. Like we don't want like just random AI plunked into any of these startups with their buzzwords. So then, in the editing process, they'll start taking out the AI, aspect that I'm like, no, wait, no, actually it's using AI in a different way. So like, there's a little bit of like, know where you are in the hype cycle. So that, you're at the right place and you're, being authentic, but also, holding on to some of these trends.
Yeah, that's a great point. And hopefully that's useful for at least some of the folks who are joining us today. I think we have some really early stage companies, at least some software companies. So hopefully that idea, right? Like it's not enough to just say you're an AI company. Now you have to really demonstrate how you're leveraging that capability. That is a capability in order to advance your greater purpose. Is that kind of what you were both getting at?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. So speaking of which, let's hop back to something that I think we touched on a little bit earlier, which is the fact that Katie, you mentioned this a few minutes ago, the fact that a lot of this stuff is hard to understand. And honestly, it's not all as sexy and trendy as AI, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for a significant climate impact and a lot of, forgive me, like potentially boring or industries or industries that aren't necessarily going to capture consumer attention. Like industrial decarbonization, I think is something we talked about previously, Katie. So would you mind maybe talking to us for a few minutes about how you think folks can make that interesting when they're coming to you? And then Saloni, I'd love your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to kind of use those little bits like in storytelling, so like founder's story. Is the founder's story interesting? Is the overall market interesting? I mean, some of the kind of sectors that sometimes I struggle with would be like building efficiency. You're like, oh, okay, more like upgrades of like LED lightings or like software that manage like a building, like, okay. Or sometimes it's like trying to write about a certain type of biochemical where like the chemical is like super like nitty gritty. Like I wrote about this company Doxycycle, which is a very cool company. They turn like carbon dioxide into chemicals. And it was like, the chemical is this, like, it makes ethylene. And then you're like, well, what does ethylene make? I have to explain that. And so it's like very highly technical. So sometimes I'll struggle with things like that. So I'll kind of grab onto like a founder story or like this market, the end product, is whatever the chemical makes, everyone's like seat chairs in their cars or, whatever. You're like trying to kind of connect it to the audience and tie something together that has some kind of like emotional resonance with your audience to, make it compelling instead of just kind of being like going too deep into the rabbit hole. And I don't know if that's applicable to on the investor side, but Saloni.
I was giggling because I sat across from Sarah at breakfast as she was describing Doxycycle to me, and I was like rapidly scribbling.
I know that's cool, but
lots of arrows. And no, I mean, and I would say we love industrial decarb. we love, carbon to fuels, carbon to ethylene, and so, we do live in those worlds. I do, to Katie's point, I think and to maybe something I said earlier, I think the ability to kind of explain simply and drive to relevance of what you do is critically important. And you know, that whether it's sort of relatability, Katie, to your point, to like, you know, ethylene is like the building block of like all these different, you know, pet chems downstream, and then makes basically everything. Or, you know, here is an industrial decarb, to your point on Founder Story, you know, we have a cement decarb company, and the founder comes from like a 3rd generation cement family, and, you know, is deep in kind of understanding what the friction points are, you know, back to that. What are the friction points in deployment? What are the pain points for your customers? So I think, you know, really bringing, ultimately it's people making decisions to do or not do things, and adopt or not adopt things. So if it's a material substitution, who are the people who need to be convinced to use this new biochemical, or, you know, to use an alternative material? What are the considerations that go into that decision they make? Because it can be the coolest tech in the world, but if somebody doesn't make a decision to use it, you don't have a market and a business. And so who is that person? Why does that person do things the way they do things? And how will you integrate your product into their workflow? And that could be a software workflow, it could be a material handling workflow, it could be, but bringing to life the process. And again, this is why I love, I just get to sit and be educated all the time. But if you as a company can't articulate that, when it comes time to kind of design a go-to-market strategy, that you've got to know how to do that. You've got to know what juncture to address. If it's a material substitution and it's in buildings and you need to change building codes to get it wired in, like that's a good thing to know. So you should probably start, you know, there. Or if it's a matter of getting it, you know, if it's a matter of talking to developers, or is it a retrofit product, you know, so all of those things, I think, being able to pan out from the technical and actually talk about, you know, for the companies of the stage we're at, and we're not, to Katie's earlier point, you know, sort of, we're not really doing companies that are still kind of in the lab where the technical diligence might be all of it. We're really focused on commercialization ready, kind of near commercialization ready companies. So your ability to understand what the go-to-market will look like is critically important to driving revenues.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that knowing your pitch and knowing yourself and the challenges of your pitch are just really crucial, because, you know, you're leading with like the top things. The most interesting things are coming at the top, you know, and then you're working through like the other things. So I think knowing, you know, like, hey, my technology is super confusing, or like, you know, maybe my founding story isn't that interesting, you know, and like layering, you know, what are your like A games up top, you know, for an investor or a journalist. You know, a journalist is going to read, you know, spend 30 seconds on the email and make a decision whether to take the phone call. You know, maybe an investor will probably spend a little bit more time, maybe not, but kind of knowing the holes and, you know, how to start with, you know, your best game first.
Yeah, that's great. So I wonder, and hopefully this is helpful for some of the audience, and I just want to plug a little quick reminder to that our audience is welcome to ask questions as we go through this conversation. Maybe we can spend a quick minute or two talking about some ideas for how folks can find that connection, right? Like, especially, I think that there seems to be kind of a trend in climate where a lot of founders are tech, and they come from that background, which is incredibly important expertise. So that, but making that connection, I think Katie said something about like emotional resonance with your reader. And Solana, you mentioned like your understanding your customer. And it sounds like we're suggesting that folks start with that, right? Or at least that's like a hook you can lead with. How do you suggest folks kind of test out what might resonate with those different audiences?
I mean, for us too, you know, there's a timeliness, like why should we be writing about this right now? So, you know, like it's what's the story and why now? I mean, I think that, you know, crafting your pitch and, you know, saying either verbally saying it to, you know, your colleagues or, you know, your friends or family, and, you know, writing it out, in an email, and then just like having people critique it, make it as simple as possible until you still have the story, but it is as streamlined and simple as possible. So
Mhm.
I think just, getting as much feedback as you can.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, the why now, why you, to Katie's point, is, I think perhaps, we're looking further out, I guess, in terms of trying to think about, is this timely? Is this, I used to work in public equities, being early can be the same thing as being wrong, so you do want to make sure, and that kind of applies in capital consumptive companies as well, sometimes. And so, why you, why now? I do think, not to overharp on this customer piece, but this is, just where the stage at which we invest, really demonstrating, talk to 10 prospective customers, have the conversation and test your value proposition out on them, because your investors they will call prospective customers and test your value proposition out on them as part of diligence. And so, Katie, to your point, sort of know what your strengths and weaknesses are going in. And if you are able to articulate kind of an understanding of what those will come back. Yes, people may say XYZ, they're not ready for this, but here's why, we believe we're going to be able to sell through that, or embed it into your product or your go-to-market strategy even better, and reflect an understanding of what the challenges are. I'd say that resonates, because it just, that's the work, and it just means you're already, you're ahead of it and doing it. So I think, to Katie's point, it's getting that feedback and demonstrating, who to get feedback from and for what, and that you are open to it, and to assimilating it.
I think from like a journalist perspective too, you can reach out to, some of the like the smaller players, like, I don't know if you want to, send your kind of like a draft of a pitch to, like a really big publication, right away, but like you can work with the journalist, like pitch them, and if they're like maybe a smaller publication, like see what resonates with them, and and then like do your pitch on like a phone call and kind of see what's working. Maybe make sure you probably want to save like a really large publication if they're kind of do some kind of big story on you want to make sure you have it like baked by then, but you can kind of try it out on maybe like some smaller outlets.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And that also makes me think of like local outlets, right? So there might be an angle where you could, especially if you're in an area that's not already potentially like climate saturated, or you're doing something that's very different, or you have like your company is in that locale for a specific reason, you might have some success with just local journalism, and that's a great way to, with local journalists, and that could be a good way to practice as well.
Yeah. Or like, of like a friendlier publication, more of like an industry type of publication, who, are, you are comfortable with them and you read their stuff and you're pretty sure they're not going to be like writing, a hit piece on you. Probably be a little easier to kind of hone in.
And that's a great idea too, especially for companies that are working in those more complicated industries. So Saloni, this might be applicable. You may have some experience with some of your companies about like pitching really deep industry publications, right? Like I don't work necessarily in the building space, but I would imagine that there are like publications dedicated to like buildings or construction. So those might be opportunities for folks, especially earlier stage, to get some attention in front of their customer, or to Katie's point, to like test out their pitch by working with folks that maybe already understand a little bit of the tech and the problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah. Trade publications can definitely be kind of an interesting avenue also to get exposure and to kind of start to maybe invite some of those conversations.
Yeah. Awesome. Absolutely. And then really quickly back to our conversation about keeping it simple. I would imagine that a lot of folks in this space have friends and have close friends and family outside of the space. So I think what you mentioned earlier, like practicing your pitch on your family, right? Can your partner understand what you're doing, or can your best friend or your, I think it's the stereotype is, can your mom or your grandmom understand like what you're doing and why it's important? It is a little bit of a cliche perhaps, but it could also be really useful, especially if what you're doing is very complex, right? Or very deep within the supply chain, or deep within an industry that is not well known to customers, or to kind of the general public.
Yeah.
Awesome. So along those lines, let's switch for the last few minutes to those specific pitches. And I know we've touched on this a little bit, but I thought maybe we could spend a few minutes just diving in just a little bit more about specifics for pitches. So, and maybe even like super tactical. So Katie, like you mentioned, Axios is very deal focused, and this is so doing your own due diligence on who you're pitching, right? So are there some things, some kind of general recommendations you have for folks about the homework they should do on the outlet, on the journalist? Do you need to do both? Like, how do you kind of gather that information about what a journalist is writing about and what they may be interested in?
Yeah, definitely homework on the journalist and the outlet. Axios isn't itself particularly deal focused, but our newsletter is the Climate Tech Deals newsletter. So ours is very financially focused. But at Axios, there's several newsletters. Generate is probably the most well-known, focused on climate. We have like What's Next, which is a lot of kind of EV transportation stuff. So yeah, I think it's crucial to know the journalist and also know the publication. I mean, the pitches that don't resonate with me, are ones that are kind of like cookie cutter, like boilerplate, like you can tell they kind of just spammed it out. It's not tailored to me at all. Is, something I wouldn't cover, or something that like I know everybody else has this information, is being sent this information as well. I mean, sometimes you can get away with that if you're like a huge, sexy company, like back in the day, early Tesla or something, everyone wants to know about Tesla, they can spam the journalists. But, if you're kind of sending the same information out to all the journalists, there's not kind of an original angle to kind of what the journalist wants to write. So those are kind of the pitches that kind of are fallen deaf ears for me.
And kind of along those lines too, especially because you've worked at Fortune and at Axios, which are very different publications, I would imagine, in a lot of ways. In either or both of those scenarios, are you interested in kind of that, like, getting to know you outreach? Like, hey, I'm a pre-seed founder. This is what I'm trying to do. I'd love to just kind of start a conversation with you about what my company is doing. Is that something that works either for Axios or for some other, potentially for other publications maybe that focus on maybe longer form content?
I think that if they want to be like, I want to chat, there's this company coming out, maybe they're in stealth. I want you to learn about the company and they're going to have this news. I think I kind of feel like I wanted to be leading somewhere.
Okay.
So the pitches where you're like, hey, let's just get a coffee. A lot of times I don't take those because I just don't have time, because I have to put together, a newsletter 4 days a week, and also have 2 small children. And so
a lot.
I have to, I have to, be very methodical with the actions I take. Yeah, if they're like, I want to get a coffee, I'm like, well, kind of what's going on? What's the news? So, I'll do a phone call and kind of get to know them, but with kind of the undertones of like, hey, we're going to be launching this, and we can talk to you about this. I think that kind of has to be going in a certain direction, but I like being aware of what's coming out. So when, I open up my email in the morning and, it's like, hey, today we announced, a $30 million raise, and everybody else, we sent it to everybody else too. Then I'm like, well, I guess I'll put it in our like links section, because, it's already out there now, and I haven't even talked to you, and I don't have any information about the company, and I have to put out the newsletter in like 2 hours. So like, I like having a heads up on the news that's coming out.
Yeah.
Or to have a greater chance of being highlighted in our stories instead of just being dumped into the news section. I like to be aware. Yeah. Like, so maybe start a dialogue over email, but like, don't ask for like too much time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So email is kind of the
For
best
me.
way to,
Yeah.
Awesome. And then, so Saloni, same question for you, like.
Yeah, no, I was
what's
just,
your
this is great.
preferred
I'm learning
contact,
so much
like-
from Katie.
Yeah.
This is, it's fun. So I would say it's funny, and this is just the practical reality to Katie's point. I mean, a lot of this is us trying to triage return on time, right? Like, what is we're also trying to figure out like where to invest and where we think it will lead to something, to Katie's point. And so I think for us too, it's, is the communication. And so the reality is like warm contacts are always, get a little bit more time than cold ones. We feel like, all of us, my partners and myself, our team has been kind of out in the climate world for a while. So hopefully you can find one of us who you have some connection to kind of come in through. Not always, obviously, in that, there's a self-selecting piece, or not a self-selecting, but sort of a selection bias there that, we're very aware of. And so, we of course are going through everything, but this is the practical reality of when you've got, a warm intro that also is designed, or a cold email, but that is designed to be pertinent and reflects an understanding of, who we are, what stage we invest at, what profile of businesses we like, and tend to invest in. The spam ones are just challenging. It's clear no thought or no intentionality was put into the communication. And similarly back, you're like, this is probably not a great fit for almost those reasons. And so I think that's definitely, in terms of kind of breaking through, reflecting an understanding of sort of how to get to us and how to tee it up in a way that relates to what we've done, what we have articulated in terms of our scope, and the types of companies we like to work with is kind of necessary, I feel like.
Yeah. That goes back, I think, to what we talked about at the very beginning, like demonstrating that you understand the person you're talking to is a demonstration that you can understand how to talk to your customer.
Yes, totally.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been a fun kind of common theme through this conversation.
Yeah. If you're spamming your customers, you're probably not getting a lot of traction, right?
Right. I don't know who else has like 30,000 unread emails in their personal inbox, right? Because of all the spam that I accidentally signed up for over the years.
Yeah.
And so along those lines, and assuming the person sending the email has done their homework and it is the right stage and they have made it applicable for you, what about like including a pitch deck or something like that? Is there like a kind of sweet spot presentation link? Then someone in the audience dropped this question in the chat, so I appreciate them for sharing that and would love your thoughts on that.
That's for you, Saloni, I think, right?
Yeah.
Oh, got it. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
No. I don't want to be prescriptive on length. I think it's just, are you hitting the points? Who are you? Why are you uniquely suited to do this? Or, what is the product? And look, and I know there was another question around this. We don't expect every company to have perfectly iterated on product market fit. And by the way, the markets are changing so fast in the climate space that it's almost like an oxymoron to be like, I'm a climate company that's found perfect product market fit that is like static and durable. That, kind of being dynamic and nimble and evolving is part of what it means to operate, as a young company in this space. And so I don't want to be prescriptive on length. I think being really clear on what the pain point is that you're targeting, what the catalyst is going to be for adoption, sort of all of that kind of that we discussed earlier, that you understand, who your customer is. And that's all. I think if you can get that across in a deck, an understanding of why this hasn't happened already, sometimes people are like, of course, I'm going to take over the world. Like all of these things line up. Okay, great. Well, what are the barriers? And it's a balance, right? Because if you come in and you're saying, here's all the reasons why what I'm doing is super hard and impossible, like that's also not. So it's obviously a balance, but I think the more compelling conversations and sort of communications from companies are ones that are just specific and grounded in how they are, how they designed, why they chose and how they design, why they chose this problem, how they designed the solution, and how they're going to get it adopted.
Awesome. Those are three great questions to answer. And we have two good questions from the audience as well. So first, and Katie, maybe let's start with you for this one, is can you tell us about a time when a pitch did break through the noise, either in a good or a bad way? And what was like the thing that really got your attention?
I think right after I started Axios, I got like a cold email. I got like a cold message via LinkedIn, which is like not a good platform to kind of hear like story pitches. But I was like, okay, I'll chat with this investor. I won't say what it is, but and like the website was like really funky, like super, like obviously didn't invest in any marketing, like and de-emphasize like marketing design. But then I took the call and like super interesting portfolio, like just tons of companies, startups in their portfolio. And so I talked to a bunch of the startups and, like obviously like legit investor doing a lot of investments, just like kind of hadn't emphasized like the kind of marketing and branding and all this stuff about their firm. So that one kind of like surprised me to get like a cold email, like a cold pitch via LinkedIn that ended up being like a very fruitful conversation.
What made you take it, out of curiosity?
Yes, exactly.
Well, sometimes when you're a journalist, like people have like stories to tell that aren't alternative stories. Maybe they were someone who was fired from a company, or they were, they're like an underdog story. So sometimes you want to like vet even like kind of weird, unusual things that come in, because they can be like something that is, like an interesting story underneath, an unpolished story like coming in. So
Interesting. Yeah. And then our last question from the audience, and Shalani, this might be more for you, but Katie would love your thoughts too. Can you talk a little bit more about crafting a story specifically on market size, and how to strike that balance between like what the vision is, like what the TAM is, but then also the fact that, Shalani, as you mentioned, like early stage startups aren't going to have that perfect product market fit and may not be able to may not have be able to prove out the vision that gets them to this TAM.
Yeah, and this will be, I'll give one investor perspective. Every investor, like every company, is different. So take this for what it's worth. I personally tend to try to look to analog markets. And so because climate markets are new, you need to think about, what's the profile of the activity that's being done and what's the analog for that. So, Katie, you referenced carbon accounting. It's okay, well, what's the analog? Is it ERP systems? Is it, ERP systems specifically for, in a certain vertical? Like, what's the right way to think about the budget? Is it coming out of a compliance budget? Is it coming out of a sustainability budget? What's the right way to think about the universe of companies to which this activity will extend, and what sort of a reasonable budget is to think about for what those companies would spend on it? And maybe, we think it's going to change over time as it becomes sort of a more rigid compliance requirement. And so it does require kind of some creativity for sure. I mean, the other thing I think about is like if you're deploying into an incumbent industry, so into cement, or if you're looking at circularity, or if you're looking at, what is the profit pool that you are trying to take a share of? And make sure that you reflect, that you're thinking about pricing relative to that, right? If you're in a relatively low margin industry, or, if you're thinking about, okay, how many dollars is this going to cost per ton of cement produced? Is that a reasonable sort of price point and market size to think about? Can your customers absorb that? It's like, okay, well, actually they're going to have a whole new cost structure to absorb, because you're going to have, a new carbon, they're going to get, whether it's CBAM or ETS or, some other, so they're going to have to find budget for this, and there is ROI. But I think some of it is like, it varies by situation, but the like massive top down, TAM's going to be a gajillion. And again, different investors are different on this. Grounding it in like some either analog or understanding of an existing, profit pool is, I find helpful. It's what I end up trying to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Like secret option C, like I don't care as much about TAM as I care where the money's coming from. And if you have to invent a whole new like market structure,
Well, and
that's a
that
lot
is your
harder
TAM,
than-
right? I
Yeah.
mean, your addressable market is, and the size of your addressable market is a function of, how much will people pay and how many of them.
So true. Thank you. Katie, any final thoughts on that? And then we will wrap up because we are just about at time.
I mean, I think that's less applicable for journalists. I mean, I'll write
Yeah.
about a small sector and a large sector. I mean, I think maybe just thinking about that a little bit more is that I think that you should have kind of your story crafted, or you should be at a certain stage in development before you want to talk to a journalist.
Yeah.
Just because, I mean, there are some exceptions, if you're, like a multi-seasoned like tech founder who've done a bunch of companies and you're just like, want to get attention, so you can raise your first round or something, you can talk about your background and what you're going to do. But like, if you're building something that like is going to shift a lot, and your like tech is going to shift and your market's going to shift, then it's better to go to the journalist later, because you don't really want your like story out there that is kind of an inaccurate story, because the information's out there in the media, and then like it's always there and it'll be compared to, it's like shaping your story in the wrong way. So I would think like make sure you have your kind of story planned a little bit before you connect with the journalist.
Yeah, that's a great point, that there are absolutely times when it's too early to talk to media and too early to kind of push your story to the public. That's a great point. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your time today. This was a fantastic discussion. And for everyone else who joined us today, thank you for your time. Please reach out on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with if anyone has any more questions or anything on LinkedIn. And Katie and I will both be at Verge. So please, if you haven't already, consider joining us there. Startups can actually apply for a 40% discount, and I believe there should be a link in the chat for that. And maybe we can convince Saloni to come join us there as well.
I would love to. I'm across the country for a board meeting, but I'm going to try to make it.
Yes, well, hopefully we will see many of you in San Jose in October, and please do come by and say hello. And thank you again, Saloni and Katie. Really appreciate your time, and I hope